Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, everyone in between, theists and atheists alike. This is the place. I am Diana Clarion. This is the place for spiritual and intellectual honesty where we are committed to a process rather than a conclusion. And tonight is going to be another wonderful show. We've got Stephen Hoyt with us again. We're going to be talking about justification of atheism and theism because we've got to do both sides of the coin here. That's only the fair thing to do. And Daryl is with me also. Hi, Daryl. How you doing?
I'm doing good and glad to be here and good to see you.
Oh, this is a very, very good thing. Dr. Jones gave me a few things to read a little bit ago. He sent me a message. We were on the phone a little earlier. And if I can start in with this from the link to tonight's show, he wrote, games between two players of the kind where one player wins and one loses become a familiar tool in many branches of logic during the second half of the 20th century. Important examples are semantic games used to define truth, back and forth games used to compare structures, and dialogue games to express or perhaps explain formal proofs. The links between logic and games go back a long way. If one thinks of a debate as a kind of genre, then Aristotle already had made the connection. His writings about syllogism are closely intertwined with his study of the aims and rules of debating. Aristotle's viewpoint survived into the common medieval name for logic, dialectics, which I will add on this side is not to be confused with Dianetics, but that's another story. Back to Dr. Jones. In the mid-20th century, Charles Hamblin revived the link between dialogue and rules of sound reasoning, soon after Paul Lorenzen had connected dialogue to constructive foundations of logic. There are close links between games and teaching. Writers throughout the medieval period talk of dialogues as a way of teaching or testing the use of sound reasoning. We have at least two textbooks of logic from the early 16th century that present it as a game for an individual student. And Lewis Carroll's The Game of Logic, 1887, is another example in the same genre. There are plenty of examples too, although probably there has not been enough continuity to justify talking of a tradition of teaching logic by games. Now, Daryl, have you ever worked with any of this? I know that I learned a little bit of game theory, but that was about 40 years ago. I unfortunately have forgotten more than I learned. How about you?
Well, no, this is kind of a first for me, other than it does remind me of a song, which a lot of things do. But John Lennon put out a song called Mind Games, and I think that may have had kind of a connection to the subject.
Okay. There's something else that Dr. Jones sent on to me from some of the dialogue that was going on in Philosophy of the Place, the Facebook group that we maintain. It's from Stephen Hoyt, who wrote, I think it's mistaken to say that one's atheism is grounded or justified based on any particular conception or tradition or mythology about deity. On the one hand, there's the question of whether there are deity and what we mean by the term. On the other is a swath, a rather large one, of what folks say about it and how they talk about it. Clearly, if Yahweh is asserted, one could admit that there are good reasons to think that deity is not real or doesn't exist, but this could simply imply that one is a theologian rather than an atheist. Consider the aphorism that everyone is an atheist to at least one God. Well, it's a poor trope. One rejects a conception of a deity and can do so without being atheistic. Consider the entire Hebrew tradition of saying that what God is while rejecting. Let's see if I can do this again, sorry. Consider the entire Hebrew tradition of saying that what God is while rejecting that what they say, what they just said God is what God is. Okay, say that 10 times fast. You know why I stumbled over that.
Sounds
If
kind of
not, if not a theologian, then perhaps a cultural critic or historian or any number of other things which also don't entail atheism. Certainly, the historicity of the facts seen in the Talmud exemplifies the point. Two, as another example, this is a hallmark of God talk with respect to Brahman. It is in rejecting all conceptions that one is an atheist. Chiefly, it's rejecting the existence of any inarticulable organizing principle, which doesn't necessarily need to be thought of as a personality or even some object which exists as what we mean when we say this object exists. Here it is. Okay, that's a mouthful. I catch my breath, Daryl. You have anything on that?
Well, I'm not sure. One thing that I did seem to get from that was that the fact that most who actually consider themselves to be theists actually do reject a number of gods. I mean, there's been no telling how many gods that people have believed in over time, and generally speaking, well, I don't know. There may be as many that believe in gods as there is that believe in God singular. I don't know. I don't know what the statistics would be on something like that, but one who believes in only one God would reject many gods, I'm sure, that they don't believe in. So,
And there we have it.
yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Now, Stephen goes on. It is true, generally speaking, that everyone rejects the existence of at least one God, but not true that an atheist accepts at least one. Yeah, I can definitely go with that. When one sets about rejecting all conceptions of the divine, one is entered into metaphysics because one is no longer connecting atheism with God talk, but rightly with the idea of deity itself, in which case only logic, sans any empirical means of indication, stands as possible justification. In that case, since logically sound arguments for and against the existence of deity are completely easy to proffer, and since these will contradict each other in most cases, given the binary nature of the proposition, foregoing the fact that logic tells us nothing about reality, justifying atheism or theism isn't genuinely important to the question itself, do gods exist? But instead, to all other motives one may have for asserting it. There is one question: do deity exist? The motive to answer the question must be honest, and the answer can only be that, it seems to me, deity do or don't exist, if one is an atheist or a theist. The motive to say Yahweh at all doesn't exist is completely irrelevant to that question, but to the question of whether or not someone has offered a reasonable description of what such deity may be like if they do exist. Okay, deep breath, Diana, and a cup of coffee. Daryl, anything you have to say?
Well, I think these are ideas that could need to be broken down and explained a little bit.
And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, when you just read it off like that, it's kind of a little bit difficult to keep up with. So look forward to some explanation here.
And then we have some commentary that Dr. Jones asked me to read also, something he wrote back in 1978 about the Abjad. Are there any coherent illustrations as to why we shouldn't avow an ancient Abjad, which is the writing system of the Old Covenant, as something that is intentionally and traditionally ambiguous and yet truly stunning and the masterpiece of art itself, i.e., in that it's a creative writing febrile that's so contagious, awe-inspiring, and sovereign of a different kind. And about this awe, there is a strange forsooth that shadows in a particular, and yet it cannot yield the intent of an author accurately, but without hesitation. It speaks as if it were alive while it serves as the best template for the creative process and the transitional states in theology and the poetic side of philosophy. Jonathan Safran Foer said, as translated by Nathan Englander, early Jewish sages viewed the lack of pure or objective truth as positive. One must come to faith by active intellectual engagement, i.e., as a cognitive operation. As reinforcement for the traditional aspects of this abjad, a scroll of the Hebrew writings must contain only consonants, thus forcing the reader into a creative process by having to determine contextual grammar, non-contextual grammar, inflections, and the pragmatics. Thus, Jewish law is linear and moving forward from the constant creation and interpretation of texts. So, I ask, what do these transitional creations suggest about extant translations of the Old Testament? And how much of these creative processes influenced the theological gloss for Old and New Testament translations, hence the meta language of its theology? And what translation model isn't extremely synthetic and subject to missing the mark? In an attempt to get Protestants back to Rome, Bellarmine, Cano, Genabard, Lindanus, and others participate in a movement against the theological certitude of revocalization, i.e., in an effort to cast doubt upon the ancient Hebrew writing system, for their mission was simple: to keep the purity of the writings, whatever they might mean. To them, it was best to reject all of the theological notions of practicing revocalization, i.e., as the means to supporting church doctrine. For this reason and others, they made the argument that the vowel points were not authentic in any sense, and that the consonantal text was nothing less than ambiguous. The Reverend Mitchell Dahoud, professor at the Pontifical Bible Institute, was an American Jesuit and an authority on Semitic studies. He said, "I am not so naive as to believe that the Masoretes understood the fine points of archaic poetry." He went on to say, "The modern textual critic must consequently recover many of the syntactic and lexical treasures of Hebrew poetry from the thicket of Masoretic points." Some want to paint the Old Covenant writings as theological models of certitude, i.e., as if we understand the intent of each and every author. But the evidence, and lack thereof, suggests that it's not reasonable to approach this ancient writing system with the assumption that our conclusions can be accurate. Nevertheless, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, Owen, and others used revocalization as a means to satisfy their theologies, not theory nor reasonable linguistics. So it's in this sense that the Old Covenant has been batted about and treated like abstract art, which the latter is, in keeping with the tradition of the Jewish scribes. For this appears to be in step with most Jewish models and practices, unlike Catholic and Protestant modeling, which force a conclusion not consistent with the early use of the ancient abjad. One more deep breath. That is a mouthful, Dr. Jones. I don't know, Daryl, do you have anything to say with that?
Well, my response would be that, it'd be okay to look at the Old Testament as art, if we looked at it that way, instead of as many people mistakenly do, looking at it as something inerrant, and especially something inerrant from a God.
It is really interesting to me as I've been around here and I've been working with Dr. Jones, with you, Daryl, with Bob, to see that there's a separation, between thinking about whether God exists, whether a certain God exists, whether a God is without existing. I'm still wrapping my head around all of this. I have to admit it. It's a lot. It's a lot to consider, and I think it's probably time to look at the clock and see that Mickey's hands are on the 12, and we can have Dr. Jones perhaps explain a little bit of this and set me straight again for the next 5 minutes until I forget it again.
I so enjoyed sitting back listening. You did very, very well. I loved the reading concerning game. Tonight's show is about justification of atheism, question mark, exclamation, and then money, 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 money. The same thing is true with justification of theism, ending with money, 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 and chess moves. So is this but a chess game? That is, are we simply making up the moves as we go along? And when I was speaking with Stephen Hoyt on the phone, we had a lot of fun, and we always do when we are chatting a bit. And so we want to, as I think it was Skeptical Jed asked for Stephen Hoyt to make it very, very pragmatic tonight. And that's what we need to do. I mean, let's cut to the chase. What does all of this mean? And the reason that I wanted you to read just a bit of what I wrote back in 1978 is to nuance that most people who make an argument that is of justification of theism or justification of atheism, typically when they approach the text, they're approaching the text in a very ignorant sense of the word. And it would be like me applying basketball rules to, let's say, a football game. And so thankfully we don't do that normally, but when it happens, it creates clash. And so with all of that said, I want to get Stephen on the show. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, if you wrote that in 1978, you are a brave soul.
Let me tell you something. I got my butt kicked for actually ministering on that. And this is why, many times I teach and I teach and I teach, and I've been a teacher for years. I didn't always teach what I believed to be true, but I taught various theologies. And when you're trying to look at things linguistically, from time to time, you wanted to put something on the table, and people would go, oh, that means that we really can't trust this. I said, well, the intent of the abjad wasn't an issue of trust or faith, but it was more about the creative processes that we use, that is, to move forward. We need story, we need analogy, we need something to work with. And I thought that was good of me to do that. Some people agree, some people don't. Back then, after I stated that, I went on to preach a revival in a sense, and I said God is no more than the abstraction of the idea by which people have oriented themselves to produce a functional society. And boy, did I get hell. I even stated that if we are to look at the Christ that Paul talked about, he was this ultimate transcendent value, not God himself. And so when we look at the evolution or the creation of the God terms, most of us who have done a little bit of reading over the years, looking into it from various vantage points, we can see that people are looking into what is construed as the good. Sometimes the word theos is a replacement for the word good. I don't want to get into all of that tonight, but I'm simply saying that if we're going to be talking about some of these things, we're going to be talking about, some of the things that we will talk about in about 2 weeks. I think we're going to commit to talking about the patterns that are transmitted across multiple substrates, and see what that has to do with the chatter that's out there concerning theology. But you made some statements this morning to me, and I thought they were wonderful. They were music to my ears, and I think people are so looking forward to your explanation of what you had me post on the philosophy of the place. So go for it. Oh, just before you start, my question was to you, it seems like you take more of an apophatic approach to theology more than a cataphatic. Is that true?
It's absolutely true. And to keep it practical for anyone that doesn't geek out over this stuff, that would be similar to, or well, it actually is just another way of saying negative theology, meaning
Right.
when we talk about God, we aren't saying things that are describing God as God is. We're talking about what God might be like. And we understand through the negation, the ununderstanding of God, what we mean. We're trying to give a broad outline without filling in details, but enough of an idea of what we're talking about so that we can, like you're saying, make headway with the idea.
Right, and so many people who want to get into this and really wrap their minds around what's being stated here, look into dark theology, and you'll get that, as opposed to cataphatic theology. And so let me not interrupt you for at least 30 seconds, and let me see what you can do with the premise of your thoughts this morning, your comments.
You hear a lot in the discussion of atheists when they say, here's my justification for my atheism. It revolves around saying, well, I can't say whether or not there is a God, but what I can do is say that there isn't at least this God, whether it's Yahweh or Brahman or some particular idea about God. My comments in Philosophy of the Place were to say that it doesn't matter whether or not you negate, reject, or accept any idea of God. And again, that goes back to, even if there is a God, whatever we think about God is going to be wrong, because God is supernatural, not natural. And the only way that we can talk about things is in natural terms. So just as a matter of fact, logically, we can't expect anything that we say about God to describe in some meaningful way, as much as we would like it to. The meaning comes from how we explain the idea of God, not that our meanings actually describe God. So the main point would be justification for atheism has to stand aside from any good or bad descriptions of or God talk that exist. We have to consider the actual question of any God is a possibility from any perspective. And in the minimal sense that I would say a definition of God would be is some organizing principle of reality that we can't articulate much about, if anything at all, other than to say that it's an organizing principle. And whether or not that means it's got a mind or intentions or things like that, those are also things that are irrelevant to the question of this organizing principle. Now, there will be people that say, well, yeah, it matters that we talk about a Christian God or a Jewish God or an Islamic God or Hindu Brahman and those sorts of things. But those are important to other things than the question of, does this thing exist? We would want to be saying, yes, this thing exists, and here's how I describe it. And that description becomes something that's something that we can refute or accept all on its own, and it has no bearing. Our rejecting any one of those ways of talking about God it doesn't have any bearing on the question itself: does God exist? So that was my point there. A lot of atheists come in and say, well, we know for sure in these days and times we can consider the Old Testament and New Testament to be fiction and myth, and not really, in most cases, describing any actual events or real people. And so whatever it's talking about, I can just reject as not true, because factually it gets a lot of stuff wrong. Well, okay, great, but that doesn't have any bearing on whether or not the stance or the position that there are no gods is a justified position to hold. because, again, saying that Yahweh doesn't exist doesn't entail to any kind of vacation for a question of whether or not there is a God, or whether or not we're talking about God correctly. Does that make sense at all?
It does, but one of the questions that I would ask in light of Apathetic theology would be, if you take, let's say, a naturalistic approach, and it almost sounds like tonight you're saying, don't raise your expectations. Perhaps you need to lower them, and you won't get so disappointed, which I think is brilliant. But it's if we take an ontological approach, that is toward the question of God, is that the approach that we should take only? And the reason that I ask that, it's because theologians, for the most part, they do not look at God as existing, that is, ontologically. They're not looking for the essence of God or the being of God or anything like that. That is, in a naturalistic sense, they're talking about God completely subsequent to that particular axis. And so if we were to take a multi-axial approach, that is, to the question of God, if we looked at God on another axis absent the existence issues, would that not provide something for us to look at that might be a bit different than what we typically hear in the ramblings of the great debate, in other words?
Well, just as a matter of strategy, when we start going the ontological route, you run immediately into problems. And I tried to kind of open with one of them, which is saying that if God is everything that nature is not, and our understanding of anything is predicated on nature, then how can we purport to be able to conceive of God, much less explain God, because our explanations will be the nature, which God transcends. And if you say that, on the contrary, that, well, God is immanent too, well, then you're looking at, okay, then that's God is either a separate object in the world that we can point at and touch and feel and see, and where is that then? Or God is nature, just a synonym for nature. And at that point, you've neutered any importance of calling it God. You're just talking about nature. So those are some problems that we get into when we start saying God is X, Y, and Z. And theologians will be quick to say, theology is not the study of God or what God is. Theology is the study of what God is like, with the admission that the question of God, and I'm going to paraphrase Herbert McCabe, who's a Dominican priest, that the validity of the question of God is from the question, why anything at all? Why is there anything at all? And that's what makes the question of is there a God valid? And when we talk about God, we aren't talking about, we don't know what God is. We have no concept or means to say that we know that what we're saying corresponds in any way to what we're referring to. Just that we have this idea of some beginning cause, and we're exploring it, and it's not nature itself, it's something beyond that. And it's the exploration that matters, not necessarily that we say that what matters about God talk is that there is a God, and we have accurately captured what that thing is. In fact, one of the things I usually try and capture in hypothesis anyway, is with the two universe scenario, where in two identical universes, there's a God and not a God in the other, and they're identical in every other respect. So we have God talk and meaningful God talk in both kinds of universes. But how does God talk how is it meaningful in both universes when one universe is absent of any gods? Well, it kind of illustrates the point that it may be meaningful because there is a God, but it may not be meaningful. And so you have to ask what's important about the question, and why is the meaningfulness of that question? How does that matter to human beings? And that's when you get more to the important parts of what it matters to being a theist and an atheist, is what are the consequences of holding this belief? And if it matters in some real way, well, then you have to start taking a little bit more seriously than other questions. And, as far as atheism, since we're starting off talking about atheists, if there's no payoff in short, if there's no practical utility to having an answer to the question of yes or no, there is a God, or yes, there is a God, even if we know for a fact there is a God, if it's identical to a universe that has no God anyway, then it's not very important. So what would be a reason that an atheist would be interested? And subsequently, what should it matter to Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus or those sorts of things? But anyway, in short, I'm rambling, so I apologize for that. But in short, it takes a lot of useless conversation and debate off of the table by not making claims that are hard to justify, which would be all the ontological statements, the equivocal statements that X, Y, and Z saying what Z or how we are thinking about God, and that's subject to change. One is more liberating and leads to more meaning, and the other just kind of backs you in a corner where you either give up on it, become an atheist, or you make all kinds of adjustments mentally and gymnastically in order to keep this idea of God alive in your mind because it got some kind of meaning for you.
Okay, let's, just for the sake of thinking through something, let's create a dialectic center in that we're going to look through the lens, let's say, of an agnostic. And my usage of agnostic needs to be clear here. Let's say that agnostic, in this sense, my usage would be one who is suspending judgment for various reasons, but suspending judgment. I keep saying that if I proposed A plus B equals C, and I asked someone what A is, and little Johnny said, "Oh, I know what A is. A is a goat." And little Susie said, "Oh, A is not a goat." I would think that the algebra teacher would simply say, "Hey, listen, this is the time that you need to suspend judgment until you have something available. We don't jump at what A is." With that said, if we can look through the glasses, namely of an agnostic, in that sense, suspending judgment to the question, because many agnostics, they're very much like atheists in one sense of the word. They really don't think that we have enough to work with when it comes to the question of God. And so here is something that I want you to deal with through this particular lens. Neither theistic belief nor atheistic belief results from faculties aimed at truth that are functioning properly in an appropriate environment. Do you agree with that or disagree?
Read it one more time. You're kind of
Okay.
breaking up.
Neither theistic belief nor atheistic belief results from faculties aimed at truth that are functioning properly in an appropriate environment, and so on.
Yeah, I think if I understand or am interpreting that correctly, I would agree. It's an interesting thing when you start talking about judgments, and again, you go back to my vent as a philosopher. I don't think ultimately atheism or theism is a conscious judgment, and it's not a choice that we make. We're persuaded, again, you can make sound arguments for and against God. And which one are you going to accept? Except for the one that makes the most sense. So the logic isn't what's compelling. It's what comes before the logic. It's not that we have an a priori understanding of the world. It just means that our totality of experience has already prepared us for an answer. unless we grapple with being open to other ways of viewing why we have that question and why we're vented the way we are, we might not ever change our mind. And worse, we might not ever think of what it is that's actually compelling about the idea of God and how our meaning is tied to that. Because the meaning God isn't necessary for the meaning if what I'm saying is true.
Right.
What is this prep work, the groundwork of the totality of our experience that has already prepped us for the answer. And because we're already prepped, meaning just waiting to be had. So God becomes, or a disbelief in the existence of God just becomes a way to put a period exists, if that makes sense.
Okay, Ozzy, I think it was 2 weeks ago, he jumped on the show at the end. He did a wonderful job talking about knowledge. He pushed back on JTB, which is justified true belief, being knowledge. And he said that, if I'm not mistaken, and I stand to be corrected, he said reliability produce true belief would be better thought of as knowledge. And so in light of what he said, the second question that I would ask you would be, put forward, neither theistic nor atheistic belief results from reliable belief-producing processes. Would you agree with any of that?
Well, the strongest root that I would have would be the idea that reliability has anything to do with truth. It's, I'm not as hopeful as most epistemologists that say that justified true belief is knowledge. I actually hold that knowledge is just simply the reasons we have for being very confident about some things versus other things. Now we justify those things, and that's what gives us or builds in confidence. But it's like we were talking to Anthony a few weeks ago,
Right.
Monabosco. What he's interested in is talking about why people are confident, and he's throwing up questions or things that may help people to think through different problems that he has with what they're saying, so that their confidence is undermined. Well, really, it's to suggest something about knowledge, about the what they're claiming to know about this natural. When we talk about reliability, in the face of all this, reliability itself would simply be another confidence builder. It would be a justification for saying something is true. Reliability does not ensure that some proposition is true. It's just more likely to produce some statements that are true. But in all of that mess, what we care about is being able to distinguish what is true and what is not true. And reliability does not help us distinguish what is true and what is not true. Justification does. But ultimately, justification is just built. I like your question. I like where you're going with it, but I can't even answer it because I disagree with the way it's even framed. Maybe we can go from there. Maybe reframe the question a little bit, and I can maybe engage that.
Okay, I have plenty of other questions because I'm trying to put a framework to this show tonight, simply to get people to get to thinking about what's out there. Many of the quotes that I pull, many of the questions are not just from me, but they're from, Stanford and other universities, other professors who are really, really looking at the question and the many positions that exist in the great debate. When it comes to coherence, would it be true that neither theistic belief nor atheistic belief coheres with the rest of their beliefs, that is, within individuals themselves?
That's a good question, and I'm just going to shoot it from the hip. Based on what I've already said, our believing that there is a God or not believing that there is a God is a result of our existing beliefs before we even hear the question. So I have to answer that question one way. Yes, it's necessarily true that all of our ideas about God cohere with the web of beliefs that we already have that exist. Otherwise, we would not have a position on the existence of God at all. I would imagine, if I put it that way.
Okay, but are we talking about cohering with beliefs in the context of knowledge, or are we talking about our projection of imagination?
I'm talking in just in terms of beliefs, meaning epistemology and better propositional attitudes and dispositional attitudes. Both would be beliefs, and they could, they don't necessarily always go hand in hand. They could be in conflict. But what I'm suggesting is that the beliefs that we already have are what determine how we're going to answer the question when we first hear it asserted, there is a God. It's not that the arguments made or presented to us will necessarily lead us to a yes or no answer with that, but it's everything that we've encountered up to that moment of hearing that question that matters. So I think necessarily, if that would be the case, necessarily our response to the question of God existing has to be in line with our existing beliefs.
Okay, some agnostics, not all, would suggest that neither theism nor atheism is adequately supported by the internal states of theists and atheists. Where would you go with that?
Yeah, I wouldn't talk about it in terms of internal states. I think agnosticism is the proper view. I don't think that we can have knowledge of God in an ontological sense or a directly experiential sense, even. So whatever we're talking about as far as when we use the word God, it's not from a place of knowledge. And our experiences, we call the experiences, I don't think that we can say in any that we know it was God and that proves there was a God. I don't think we can do that. We're not I think necessarily able to have those experiences. Now, if that's the case, anything could trigger it. So I'm not really moved by people talking about God in terms of knowledge and experience.
Okay, without going any further, because I don't want to get too deep, I don't want to lose our audience. Daryl or Diana, do either one of you have a question at this point?
Well, yeah, I had a question that came up really early in what you were saying, Stephen, because it's a question that's always on my mind. When you said that God is supernatural, not natural, I still fight with what that is exactly all about, because I guess I'm the hopeless mechanist, the hopeless naturalist, when I'm thinking that people claim that God is supernatural, yet interacts with the natural world. He gives commandments, he orders people to kill their sons. Am I looking at this in a narrow way? Do I need to expand my view of God? When one says God, and I think this is a rhetorical question, among other things, just what is that God all about? It's not the God of Christianity or the gods of Buddhism or anything, right?
Yeah, it's not specific like that. I think maybe an analogy would help. And it's easy to make it these days because we're in a technologically advanced society where we have real things that we can conceptualize or abstract from. Once simulations, we can certainly understand how anything outside of, say, the sim city world could be considered supernatural. So you and I don't exist in Sim City. And we may be able to interact with Sims, but how would the Sims know that that's us interacting? That sort of thing. So when we say there's a natural realm, nature is anything that we can experience, touch, feel, tactile, and can conceive of within that framework.
Okay, which is the definition I use, yeah.
Yeah, and then anything else that might exist external to that or independent of that or alongside that would be typically what someone would say conceptually would be supernatural, that which is beyond. Now, nobody can really articulate what ontologically that is, but it's just to say it's outside of nature. Does that make sense?
That's the one I'm really fighting with because, when you say outside of nature, I'm thinking something that has no connection to nature and therefore cannot interact with it. And with your SimCity analogy, which does make some sense to me in one sense, there's the other sense that although the Sims may not know what is interacting with them, they do know that something is interacting with them, right? Or do I have that wrong?
Well, it could be. There's lots of different ways we could look at it from that perspective. But the main thing is to say that here are these two different realms. Now, it could be that there is a supernatural entity that does interact, but doesn't want anything in creation to know definitively that it is being interacted with. So I could be a programmer programming things for SimCity, and it definitely controls the structure and environment and leads people to think certain ways and things like that. I'm influencing at that point, and they may get an inkling that I exist, but they certainly couldn't prove it because I could create another SimCity that doesn't take my interaction at all and looks identical to it. Yes, indeed. Here's the SimCity, and I choose to put on a billboard. I'm programming in on a billboard. Hi, I'm Steve, also known as your God. Watch this neat trick that I do with the sky. Here, I'm going to turn it blue and now red and nifty. Well, there's going to be a natural explanation for all those things. So, you would have to wonder how it would be that those things could stand to prove that God Steve existed. You know what I mean? But the reality that we exist in, the existence of God, if God exists, it's the importance of it isn't that we know anything about God, or he would be trying to do like putting up billboards and being convincing in that way. If as far as my take goes, if there is a God, it's more of an influence that it has. And I think in terms of artificial intelligence, why we are created the way we are, and in particular in this set of circumstances, because everything that we think of is from a framework of where we exist and how we exist in it. So God can accomplish, if there is a God, and it cares about all creation and the development and progress of all sentient beings in particular, then it could set things up in just environmentally so that it accomplishes whatever it's set out to do without ever having to directly be known or understood itself or be anything but stochastic within that environment, meaning we can't pin anything on God. But still, we from that standpoint, in seeking this idea of God, we become more aware of ourselves and our humanity. And I think that's generally been the thrust of religion.
If
Yeah,
I
this is
can,
one of the-
okay,
yeah, go ahead.
If I can interrupt this, there was a brilliant comment made by D.B. Cisco. He said, "I had a friend whose motto was, 'I love being dumb and happy.'" Skeptical Jed replied, "Is he from Alabama?" My question
Easy now.
is he Roy Moore?
Hey, that kind of brings up a comment I'd like to make, because it plays right into what what I was thinking, just to put it to me in my way of thinking, the simplest way to state what's being talked about here is quite likely there's much more that we don't know than what we do. If we understand our limitations, there's many things maybe we can yet know. But at this point in time, there's quite likely much more that we've not figured out, that we don't understand, that we can't comprehend than there is that we do.
Yeah, and Stephen, your answer about God and SimCity, I'm going to have to write this down because this is giving me some idea. I'm going to have to do some thinking about this, and there may be a video in the works.
Cool.
Because I can see a point in stating that, okay, possibly a God does exist, even though we know, or even though we don't know how it interacts with us. And then at the same time, good old mechanistic me, or good old reductionist me, is saying, okay, if we don't know that if we don't know that it is interacting with us, or how it is then what is the use of considering the question in the first place? So I think that may be, that may be an episode of Vox Rationis into the future. I mean, I'm finishing one up now, and I have another one I want to put into the can. So this may be the third one, because it is.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to interrupt just for a second. I've got to go outside. We have a thunderstorm coming in, and my chocolate lab is outside in this thunderstorm. Not good, so I'm going to put him up. He likes laying down in the air conditioning in his bed. He's very, very spoiled. And so Schrodinger is his name, and so I'm going to do that. I will be right back with you guys, okay?
Alrighty, Schrodinger is wet. Schrodinger is not wet.
Those are things that are on my mind all the time. It's why I don't really care if I approach things from an atheistic view or a theistic view, because to me, again, these are the reasons why I don't care if I know that there's a God or not, because I agree with atheists. If it manifests in reality the same way as if there is no God, then what can the question signify? And in the example that I laid out, if we exist in a world where God talk is meaningful, yet there is no God, and that's fully a possibility that's the kind of universe that we're in, then it's not meaningful because there is a God. Yet we can still have God talk be a meaningful thing that we do and pursue, irrespective of whether or not there's a God. So I don't really care about the question of the existence of God. What I care about is when we approach that question and we leave it with some belief. We either walk away believing that there is a God, or we walk away believing that there isn't a God. What has that question compelled us to do moving forward with our lives with that idea in mind? So for me, that's where the thrust of everything is. And if I was a God designer of a sim city, and it's true in philosophy that all ideas are somehow contingent to place, and I've created the world sim city with some or most simulations having the question of God in mind, then I would say if there is a God, then that was necessary. That was something that God designed into our existence, so that we'd actually arrive at having the question. So the question matters, but maybe not in a specific answer, but in how we approach the question and the effects, the transforming effects that agreeing or disagreeing with that question leads us into. But anyway.
Yeah, and I guess that feeds into my big question too, is it more important whether a God exists or what one does with that God.
Yep.
Whether or not the God does exist, what am I doing with that God I claim exists? Personally, I think that it's more important what one does with that God, but I may be dumb.
I
In
doubt
the
it.
side chat, we had a little thing about being stupid, and maybe I'm being stupid in trying not to be stupid.
Stephen, I would like for you to comment on the statement I made, because it seems to me that possibly the better part of humanity doesn't want to admit that there's so much we don't know. And that's a lot of where God's come from. I mean, when we try to nail down God rather than the possible existence or whatever you want to call it, that there being something beyond us, it seems like we don't mind jumping to conclusions and we want to get on a bandwagon. So that's what I meant when I was saying that the most honest position to me seems to be that there's so much we don't yet know. And to say we act like we know it and become a theist or become an atheist and be very specific about that would be unreasonable.
Well, there's always going to be things that we don't know, and certainly we would want to say it's reasonable to talk about the laws of physics, or in the past, the way we've talked about the laws of physics, even amid all these other possible things there are to know, but we don't know. It doesn't really purchase on the fact that we are going to sometimes have a genuine belief about there being a God or there not being a God. And what's ethical to do is to try to understand why it is that we have the belief that we do, and then keep ourselves open to revising our beliefs or being open to the potential of having our beliefs changed. But also at the same time, being able to justify or explain why it is that we've come to the beliefs that we have. It's not that we have to know, to claim to know that there is a God. Just it's enough to say that I acknowledge, I believe that there is a God, and here are the reasons why. And of having justification is to say that it's responsible. When you don't have any warrant or justification for a belief, that's the only time it becomes unethical. So even though there will be people that can't make up their minds, let's say, and they're agnostic, it's not a more reasonable position that has a belief and reasons to believe something about the question of God. For them, because they have reasons that are compelling to them, then the ethical thing to do is to continue to believe what they've come to believe. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I like that response. I appreciate that.
I'm back. A tornado didn't take me away. That's great. This is some of the substance that I would like to get into just for a few minutes, because so many times when I attend, let's say, an atheist event, someone speaking on behalf of atheists, when you get those at the top, that is in the great debate, they typically get into look at all the contradictions within the biblical text. And typically what I hear is a bunch of nonsense. And this bothers me simply because when you look at this ancient object, and this is why I'm so thankful that Diana did read what I wrote back in 1978, simply because it should get people to thinking about what the substance looks like that is in this writing system. My point is, when I look at the text, it's an unpointed text. It can be pointed various ways. The Masoretes had one way of pointing it. Back in the day of Ezra, they had another way of pointing it. And so we have no evidence at all that any author ever pointed their rights, W-R-I-T-E-S. And so the intent is lost. Not only do we have lack of vowel pointings that is from the authors themselves, but we have a lack of indexical and deictic elements sufficient for doing a syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis. In other words, we don't have a clue as to what the intent is, but all of this comes from oral tradition, and when oral tradition turns into written tradition, and when people make it known explicitly that this is about a creative process, they write their law, the Torah, poetically, and they do this for the reasons of trying to connect. They have tribes who are not in agreement. They have various norms, and they're trying to get people to come together and not be so rigid, not be so black and white. They're trying to deal with a sociological construct. And this is why I said back in 78 and 79 and 1980 that God is the abstraction of an idea that we orient ourselves, that is for social purposes, etc. And I find that to be true within, let's say, this thing that we call the Old Testament. And much of that is what you were referring to earlier, is this apophatic theology, because it's almost as if you want to put something on the table and negate it. In other words, you're not trying to put forth a story as true. You're writing it poetically. I can show you, the structure over and over again where you will have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then a repeat of 7, and then 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then some atheist will come along and say, ha, 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 look at the contradiction. And I'm saying that's like going to a poets convention and trying to say, well, there is a lot of problems with your poetry because it's not cohering, and sometimes people write poetically not to present a case for something that coheres or is in concert with itself, that has concord. Much poetry has contradiction because sometimes people want to nuance conundrum. And so a lot of these writers are nuancing mystery. Paul would be one in Greek, writing Greek, who nuances mystery, mystery, mystery. The emphasis is mystery. Why would we ever take mystery as being literal? And so when I hear so many people trying to justify their atheism, that is, when they go to these biblical passages, I throw my hands up, because the majority of the time they don't know what the hell they're talking about when it comes to the substance of what is there in the text and the purpose of its presence in some sort of written canon. Does that make any sense, Stephen?
Yeah, well, two things to say, and I'll try and be brief about it. Can't you see yourself as Atticus Finch or Scout or Boo Radley? That's when you read scripture, you're asked to be you're being invited to play a part in the text.
Exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
the way I understand it. So something is true about humanity in every facet of humanity. It goes from art to politics to music, and it goes something like this. And what I'm going to do is try and say here's where we are with the Abrahamic religions, at least, and why atheists are approaching things the way they are today versus why not some other tactic. What happens in any different mode is we begin to explore and then express something in that eventually emerges in ways that we can talk about having different properties. Let's talk about pointillism in art. They've started with abstraction, and now there's this particular kind of abstraction that we can identify as being different from others, and it has its own form.
Right.
And then it comes to a middle period where it's got all of its defining features that are definitely what are the hallmarks of pointillism. And then after that, what happens is that it goes into the extreme version. It takes all of those features and makes them all extreme to a point where it becomes absurd. It becomes very rigid is one way to say that. And you can look at any particular movement in art, music, in politics, and that's typically the way it goes. And how that applies to the religious story in the Abrahamic faith is that it had before Scripture was sacrosanct. It was being redacted all the time to reflect where a certain people were in their in keeping each other together. Exactly like you're saying, God is the center mass of how people are conceiving they should come together as a particular people.
Sure.
And the Hebrews were dominated by all kinds of different cultures all throughout history, and they identified as being Hebrew based on God and how God was going to preserve them as a people and see them through all of these circumstances. So it's about freedom and liberation.
Okay,
And
but once again, God in that context is but the abstraction of an idea by which
Yes.
they oriented themselves for social construct. It isn't a philosophical claim. It's
No,
not
it's
that
not. The Judaism has never been about orthodoxy for the most part. Like any other group of people, you'll have people that are literalist in that movement or are very concerned about what are the right things to think. But overall, there's not any specific theory of Judaism about what it is. What Judaism has been is about how to act rightly in the world so that you are identifiable as God's one of God's people of this tribe. So that's kind of it didn't take a text or specific beliefs about a text to achieve that goal. So they're not interested in talking about God in ontological terms. They're talking about God in motivational terms.
Right.
So this is how we're going to rally, like you're saying again, rally together as a people. And so that would be the early phase of if we're talking about Christianity from birth from Judaism, we're talking about a central period where we've got some definite properties now in place in time and history that we can say here is something that is new, but from a derivative from this old tradition. And now we move from that very simple thing about being about rejuvenation of our goals and ideals and helping those that are less fortunate than us and achieving some kind of actualization as individuals and as a society. We've gone away from that middle period to this extreme and extremely useless idea that everything is hyperized. It's literal.
Right.
You have to believe specific things or it's no good. You have to take certain promises or creeds or things like that, or you're not one of us. So it goes, we're identifying in a hyper sense, and that's exactly how atheists are responding to that hyper nature of what evangelicalism is by being just as hyperly critical. Okay, well, if this is your form of expression, here's how messed up it is and why. And it's easy for them to do that because it's an extreme form. It's not understood in the full context of here's where we've arrived. Now, what does that mean overall? And so they, Christians have let a lot of, have moved all of the branches down so that everything is low hanging nowadays. Whereas before, if it was, more in line with Jewish tradition, it was about something else. And that something else was helping those that aren't able to help themselves. And that's how you identify it as being Jewish, not necessarily as conforming to an idea that comes from a set of scriptures, but that here's how God wants us to identify ourselves as the liberators, the eventual liberators of all the world, that sort of thing.
A straightforward question. Do you think there is justification for or of atheism? And the same question concerning theism.
What?
Okay, When it comes to justification of atheism, do you think there is any justification for atheism and or theism?
Yes, there's definitely ways to justify belief that there is a God, and there are definitely sound arguments for justifying the belief that there is no God. My point I would make in that is that because sound arguments are unassailable, we're relying on something other than logic to say that the idea has warrant. So because both positions can be justified, it means that we don't need to argue about justifying ideas about whether or not it's okay to believe in God.
You've heard it here. That was pretty simple. Diana or Daryl, do you have a comment on this?
Well, I guess my comment would be, again, toward the utility. God may be a useful concept, at least as far as some people are concerned, but it's that whole justification thing going that Stephen was talking about. And we'll go back to me. What are you doing with that God? I mean, if we don't know for sure that a God exists or doesn't, and someone tries to do something with that God, like tell me how to live my life, my personal feeling is that I don't necessarily have to pay any attention to that. So is that a concept of just, justifying an atheistic viewpoint? Or is it just not an atheistic viewpoint at all, but it's what that particular person is doing? And do I make any sense at all here?
Okay, but there, I wanted to get into making the difference between local atheism and global atheism, because most philosophers see no justification at all for global justification. I think that you would agree with that, Stephen.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to get there myself.
But maybe I'm interrupting the flow of this, but I'm simply saying back in Paul's day, for example, when he wrote about Jesus in the context of mystery only, was it useful for these people to hear about Christ as this ultimate transcendent value? And if I could put myself in their shoes, that might be very, very useful. Would you agree?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
well,
definitely.
as far as I read things, it seems to me that it would be useful to them as far as at least giving them some consolation that this world that was falling apart all around them was not as bad as they might think it would be. Is that a good thing?
Yeah,
I hope.
but if we look at some of the ancients, they actually thought that knowledge advances through the projection of imagination, and so they were all about creative process. Some people went too far with it, but just getting very, very creative is what they were about. And so we can knock them and we can damn them and laugh at them, but I would rather learn from them.
Yeah, and I agree about knowledge advancing through creativity, of all things, me, a scientist. Because, you begin with hypothesis, and what is hypothesis other than speculation, being creative? What if? So I can see the utility there. I guess my question is, how far does one take it?
Oh, I would jump in and say that I don't care how far people take it. That's their prerogative. You touched on a point that's the point that you touched on is the point that matters. It's when people start dictating how, based on some unknown, that's when we have to take notice. And no, you don't have to take an atheistic position to be a defeater of those claims. I try and And I think that's the fear of most atheists. We have to defeat theism because people are doing really shitty things with God and in God's name. And so if we get rid of the validity of the question of God and make disbelievers of everyone, all the world's problems will go away. I think that's naive if that's true.
Oh,
But
definitely naive.
yeah, and it's certainly not necessary to do that in order to have a conversation about what someone is saying is moral. Again, the thing that's most important about truth or morality is that there's a generalizing principle, something that is asserted has a principle behind it, which is universal. And if the only thing that is informing us that something is immoral is as local as a book, and even more local to an interpretation of a book, then you do not have a solid foundation for saying something is moral, and you have to make a justified you have to justify your claims outside of that very limited context of your own spiritual hoo-ha. You know what I mean? It has to apply to everybody, or why should anyone else listen?
That's a good point.
Definitely.
Daryl, what say you?
Well, something that Stephen was saying, I think, caused me to think of something that is attributed to Paul having said, and I think I still think it's profound if taken in a certain manner, and that's when he spoke about a body, being functional, and I thought that was one of the best comparisons ever made, because every one of us has one of those, and when I look at my own physical body, I don't know of any part that I'm willing to do without. If I had to start selecting, okay, you're going to have to start losing body parts, it would be difficult to decide what I wanted to do without. And when he made the analogy of comparing that to human beings, I think that is something that is so inclusive, and yet, allows each to be individuals and to be accepting of one another to the point to where we don't want to do without one another. And, to me, that's a phenomenal concept. The only problem that, when you read it in scripture, it becomes an exclusive thing because the qualification is you have to be in Christ. But one of the things, I guess, that amazes me most in looking at life itself is seeing how well humanity does function. When you can take 6 or 8 million people and put them in just a very defined location and to see it function as well as it does. Actually, I don't think we give enough credit to that functioning and say, isn't this good enough? I mean, why do we need to go beyond this and try to, and in keeping with the conversation here, go to a book and say, we've all got to follow these rules for this thing to work. It's working pretty well as it is. It has problems, but we can address the specific problems. But I love thinking in those terms, and I can't even say what it was exactly that triggered this in my thinking, but something that Stephen was saying, I think.
You're too kind.
Yeah, I've actually experienced, as we're talking right now, a bit of a pang of fear, because I'm asking some questions. And the thing I want to know is, am I making any sense at all? Because my credibility is at stake here, and my credibility is important to me.
Why would your credibility be at stake?
In reference to...
Well, in the sense that, am I making any sense or not? Because if I'm talking out my arsehole, my credibility is shot.
We do that, don't we? No,
and I don't want to be promulgating a stream of nonsense. So, this is why this question is important to me.
Are you referring to the question of God being this restricted thing, or is that what you're in reference to?
That in a general sense, yeah, the general, the global question of theism, atheism, that sort of thing. Because the last thing I want to do is spout nonsense like I've heard a whole bunch of other people spout nonsense.
I do it all the time. It's okay.
Oh, okay.
I certainly think that we need to save global atheism versus local atheism for another show, because there is a lot that needs to be discussed there.
I'd love to, yeah.
Yeah, let's approach that. Let me make a couple of comments about, the text, because so many people just want to poo-poo the text. When I listen to the majority of what we hear behind pulpits, as opposed to theologians who are very well trained in looking at the text, exegetically so, it's like two different worlds. And so let's talk about baptizo. Baptizo is the term that's transliterated as baptize. Now, to transliterate a term doesn't give that term any meaning, but the church, quote unquote, gave it a different meaning, repurposed the word entirely. If we look at baptizo within the context of Jesus, within the context of even Paul, this is a term that stood for, in other words, how we identify with something. In other words, self-identity, finding value within ourselves, not just personal identity, but how do we identify with people or a group or whatever? How do we fit in? In other words, when Jesus was speaking, he was teaching people, in a sense, how to fit in. When we talk about the baptism of the, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it was more of a construct that was put together to say, we need to have parental understanding, but parental understanding without understanding how, a son would respond to a father would be unbalanced. And then when we talk about the Holy Spirit in the context, if I talk about hagios, I'm actually borrowing a word that comes from the temple whores. And this was very frightening for those people in that day, simply because, these people were very, very self-righteous within the context of Judaism. And so when writers started introducing hagios and its many inflections, this was troubling, because, the guy that got to go upstairs with the temple whore, as opposed to staying downstairs, that was this issue of hagios. And so my point is, there was a bit of change with the word, in that people wanted to say, when it comes to someone that you would say, this person has been privileged to go upstairs with, let's say, this individual, as opposed to treating women just for purposes of breeding. And so we have to look back at the culture. Was this a step in the right direction? And so, in a sense, these people were using a very archaic way of moving from this point to that point. And today we're way ahead of all of these points. But in their day, there was a bit of usefulness for it. Does that make any sense? And so when we get into the pneuma aspect of it, this idea of spirit, it was translated as ghost, unfortunately, but if I said to you that something is inspiring, in other words, if I said something was hagios in the sense that Paul meant, he simply meant it was completely separate from what is the norm here. In other words, what the usage typically means, we're transcending what the norm was. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. And
Okay.
what comes to mind when you're talking about baptism is the difference between how John the Baptist was baptizing versus how Jesus was purported to say what baptism was going to be like, which was more of an enveloping, fiery experience. What you're talking
Right.
about as inspiration, something consumes you, envelops you inside and out, and that's the baptism that he's talking about.
Exactly.
So it's to continue the tradition of baptism in the former sense. Seems a matter of tradition, just paying homage to John the Baptist and not having any really other relevance to Christian life than that.
Exactly. That's good stuff. Before we end the program, I'm going to ask those of you who can to do something for some of the kids here. We are reaching out to the community, and we have quite a few kids that come to the studio on a regular basis, and they are being inspired, let's say, in the arts, and so many of them want to take and learn how to play the piano. And so we're asking people who can afford it to help us to buy a couple of, I think they're called weighted key electronic pianos. I think they're about $550 a piece.
I think I know what you're talking about, Dr. Jones. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we want, in other words, there are so many kids in this community that, they need some inspiration. They need someone who will love them, but give them not the piano, but give them actually, in fact, I met with some very qualified musicians over the last few days. They're going to come in here every 2 weeks and actually give piano lessons for as many kids as we can put in the studio. And they want to start something that would encourage children toward the arts. And I think it's going to be beautiful. And so if you can afford it, just get it on our website, and that would be ncgstudios.tv. Not .com, but ncgstudios.tv, and go to the donate link, or just contact us and we'll work it out, because we need to have those items simply to help some of these kids get past what's happening on the streets. And if that is something that means something to you, help us to do that if you would. But before we end the program, I'd like to hear your final thoughts. What are your final thoughts on what we've been talking about tonight, Daryl?
Well, I wanted to go back to something just briefly. I don't remember hearing if you stated it or not, and I don't know how many people would know the Greek term hagios. What isn't that one that is normally, you find the translation, the term saint?
Right. In the book of Ephesians, it's translated as saints, but it's, I don't think that Paul meant saint. Saint is more of a term that came along that means something quite different. In other words, if I said saint to anyone today, people would say, I'm no saint. And I think that the term hagios made people feel comfortable, and yet at the same time, it gave them a sense of being better than what was considered the norm. And so it was actually, the privilege of being in a situation to where they didn't have opportunity, if that makes sense. I'd like to do a teaching on that, because it's a very interesting evolution, namely of the usages of the words. And one of the things that Paul does, he takes something that in a sense was looked at as filthy, and he cleaned it up, and he repurposed the term and put it in a great direction. And also, I want to make a statement about another Greek term that has everything to do with communion. And a lot of people like to poo-poo the Bible. Koinonia means to jointly participate. And if you think about that in marriage, it simply means that, the man is not the head. It means that we jointly participate. In other words, there's equity in a relationship. I don't know about you, but if you love your wife, you don't want to be the head of her. You don't want to be over her. You don't want to be the boss or the leader. We've got to learn how to work together. And many of the things that some of these ancient writers were advocating are very, very good in principle, that is, in developing good relationships between each other. And so koinonia is one of these terms that means to jointly participate. In other words, no one's a leader, but we are sharing, back and forth. And so I find that to be extremely meaningful. There are so many other terms that are used within the Pauline corpus that are good. And then at the same time, some of the things that Paul says are crazier than hell. And so we can't look at it as Paul being this all-knowing person. And I certainly don't think that Jesus was trying to purport himself as being that way either. In fact, I think that he's more of an advocate of being agnostic. And yes, you've heard me state that here. I think that Jesus was more agnostic than anything. Now I'll get into the passages to suggest why I would think that to be true. But yeah, did that answer your question, Daryl?
Yeah, I think that should be helpful.
Okay. Diana.
Well, this has been a really, really good show as far as I'm concerned, because at least as far as I am concerned, it is again helping to expand that concept of God, whatever, outside of what I see in the neighborhood or in the country. And it speaks to the utility of God. What are we trying to do with that God? And is it even justified to do something like that?
Right.
So I'd really like to see us, pound on this over and over and over. Maybe I'll come to an understanding of it. And if I can, I'm sure just about anybody else can. I'm nothing special. So, certainly somebody else can do what I can do. And it's something I'd really, really like to see. And yeah, this has been a really, really good show for that. And call it a springboard.
Stephen, all the compliments to you. You're the reason why we're moving forward. And I'd like to thank you for being on the show. Your final thoughts, please.
Oh, I don't know that that's a deserved compliment, but I appreciate that. I think you and Daryl and Diana are three great reasons why there's a conversation taking place. And the fact that the place exists to have a conversation makes all that possible. I'm just another person having or expressing different ideas about what matters when we have the great debate, as it's called. I really want it to be a great debate, but the way that people are participating in that debate, there's nothing great about it at all. And I want to, I don't care about what side people are on. I want them to be great at understanding the side that they're on and understanding what exactly on real terms, what it is that they're rejecting, and taking the other person seriously. And then so that your dismissal of it is just as serious, can be taken just as seriously. And you've not been anything but humble in the process, because you've taken time to give dignity and humanity to the other person that you're disagreeing with. But anyway, I think more conversations like this would be good on all fronts of humanity in the current climate that we are, with everything being adversarial, but maybe approaching conversations with a bit of hopefulness in the goodness of someone else, even though they may disagree with you, it can get us to a better place in the world.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Haidt made these comments. He says, conscious reasoning functions like a press secretary who automatically justifies any position taken by the president. With the help of our press secretary, we are able to lie and cheat often, and then cover it up so effectively that we convince even ourselves. He goes on to say reasoning can take us to almost any conclusion we want to reach, because we ask, can I believe it? When we want to believe something, but must I believe it? When we don't want to believe, the answer is almost yes to the first question and no to the second. I thought that was cute. And back to my point about these kids that are coming our way, and we want to help them. If you can help support that, I would be so, so thankful. So with that said, we're out of here. Good night.
Take care, everyone.